Emily, Mark's mysterious ex, holds a secret so dangerous it could shatter everything the detectives think they know. Just when they believe they're close to the truth, her unexpected confession turns the entire case on its head. What would drive a devoted husband to vanish after his wife is brutally murdered? And what dark secrets are hidden in the shadows of their perfect life? On the morning of September 3rd, 2022, the usually peaceful suburb of Maplewood, New Jersey, was about to be rocked by a horrifying discovery. The Jones family, Mark and Laura, had always been seen as the perfect couple by their neighbors. They lived in a charming two-story house on Oak Street where they had settled down more than a decade ago. Mark was a successful real estate agent, and Laura was a dedicated school teacher. Together, they seemed to embody the ideal of suburban bliss. However, that morning, something felt off. Laura had not been seen for days, and the normally vibrant household had fallen eerily silent. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who lived next door, had always been close to Laura. Concerned by Laura's recent distance and silence, Mrs. Thompson decided to pay a visit to the Joneses' house. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The blinds were drawn tightly, and the house appeared lifeless. Mrs. Thompson's worry grew. Unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, Mrs. Thompson called the police. Within minutes, 2 patrol officers arrived at the scene. They knocked on the door repeatedly, announcing their presence, but no one responded. The officers exchanged concerned glances before deciding to enter the house. They forced open the door, and as they stepped inside, an overwhelming sense of unease washed over them. The house was unnervingly quiet, and there was a faint, acrid smell in the air that made the officers' stomachs churn. As they moved deeper into the house, they noticed signs of a struggle. Overturned furniture, a shattered picture frame, and papers strewn across the floor. The tension in the air was palpable. The officers made their way upstairs, where they found the master bedroom door slightly ajar. Lying on the bed was Laura Jones, lifeless, her body covered in blood. It was immediately clear that she had been brutally murdered. The officers quickly secured the scene and called for backup, knowing that this was the beginning of a complex and deeply disturbing investigation. Detective Sarah Miller, a seasoned investigator with the Maplewood Police Department, arrived at the scene within the hour. Her partner, Detective David Harper, joined her shortly after. As they entered the house, they were met with the same overwhelming sense of dread that had greeted the first officers on the scene. The detectives made their way upstairs, where the forensic team was already at work. Detective Miller carefully examined the bedroom. The sheets were soaked in blood, and Laura's position indicated she had been attacked while in bed. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting Laura had known her killer. The brutality of the attack indicated a crime of passion. Detective Harper, meanwhile, began interviewing Mrs. Thompson. She explained that she hadn't seen Laura in days, and that Mark had been acting strangely, coming and going at odd hours. Mrs. Thompson also mentioned hearing raised voices coming from the house a few nights before. As the detectives continued their examination, they found a key piece of evidence: a discarded knife, partially hidden under the bed, its blade stained with blood. It appeared to be the murder weapon. With the immediate scene secured, the detectives turned their attention to finding Mark Jones, who was conspicuously absent. Had he fled in fear, or was he somehow involved in this terrible crime? The answers to these questions would determine the course of the investigation. Miller and Harper reached out to Mark's friends and colleagues, hoping to track him down. As they followed up on leads, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Several people mentioned that Mark had recently reconnected with an old flame, Emily, who had been his girlfriend before he met Laura. Their relationship had ended on bad terms, but it seemed that old feelings had resurfaced. The detectives received a call that shifted the investigation into high gear. Mark's car had been spotted near Emily's apartment the night before Laura's body was discovered. This new information raised more questions than it answered, and the detectives knew they needed to speak with Emily as soon as possible. As the investigation deepened, the tension surrounding the case only grew thicker. With Mark Jones still missing, Detectives Miller and Harper knew that time was of the essence. They needed to find him before he either went further underground or worse, committed another desperate act. Their first step was to visit Emily's apartment. They arrived at the upscale building in the late afternoon, far removed from the quiet suburb where the Joneses lived. Emily answered the door, her expression a mix of surprise and anxiety when she saw the detective standing there. Emily, a striking woman in her late 30s, appeared confident yet nervous. Detective Miller explained that they were investigating Laura Jones's murder. Emily's reaction was immediate, a sharp intake of breath, her face draining of color. As they sat down in the living room, Detective Harper began with the basics. "When was the last time you saw Mark Jones?" Emily hesitated. I saw him 2 nights ago," she admitted. "He came by to talk. He was upset." "Upset about what?" Miller asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Emily sighed. "About his marriage. He said things weren't going well with Laura. They've been having problems for a while. He didn't know what to do." The detectives exchanged a glance. This painted a picture of a man in turmoil, potentially driven to drastic actions. "Did he mention anything about wanting to harm Laura?" Harper pressed. Emily's eyes widened in horror. "No, of course not. He was upset, but I never thought I didn't think he was capable of something like this." "What about you, Emily?" Miller asked. "Did you know about Laura's death before we told you?" Emily's face crumpled, and for a moment it seemed like she might break down, but she quickly composed herself, shaking her head. "No, I had no idea. This is awful." The detectives could see that Emily was struggling, but whether it was with grief, guilt, or fear, they couldn't yet determine. They continued the questioning, focusing on her relationship with Mark, and trying to uncover any more details that might link her to the crime. As they wrapped up the interview, Emily's nervous demeanor had only increased the detectives' suspicions. She claimed to have no knowledge of the murder, but her behavior suggested she was hiding something. Whether it was fear of being implicated or something more sinister, Miller and Harper knew they couldn't rule her out just yet. Leaving Emily's apartment, the detectives regrouped. "She's definitely hiding something," Harper remarked. Miller nodded. "Agreed. But what? Is she protecting Mark, or is she involved? We need to dig deeper into her background and their recent interactions." Back at the station, Detectives Miller and Harper dove into the next phase of their investigation, a deeper dive into the lives of Mark and Emily. They needed to understand the dynamics of their relationship, how it might have led to Laura's murder, and most importantly, where Mark was now. First, they focused on Mark's financial records. What they found was disturbing. Over the past few months, Mark had been making large withdrawals from his bank account, sums of money that seemed out of place for someone who lived a relatively modest lifestyle. Several of these transactions were linked to an account that wasn't in his name, but had connections to a known alias used by Emily. Next, they turned their attention to Mark's phone records. The data revealed a flurry of calls and messages between Mark and Emily in the days leading up to Laura's murder. The tone of these messages was tense, filled with discussions about their future and references to a problem that needed to be taken care of. The detectives also analyzed surveillance footage from various locations around town. The footage from Emily's apartment building showed Mark arriving late at night, staying for several hours, and leaving in the early morning. But another piece of footage caught their attention. A gas station camera captured Mark's car driving towards Maplewood, just hours before Laura's body was discovered. This contradicted Emily's earlier claim that Mark had left her place much earlier. As they pieced together this new information, a call came in from one of Mark's colleagues. The colleague mentioned that Mark had recently been talking about taking a trip to clear his head, possibly heading up to a secluded cabin that he owned in the nearby mountains. This was the first solid lead on Mark's whereabouts, and the detectives knew they had to act fast. Miller and Harper quickly mobilized a team and set out for the mountains. The drive was tense, both detectives fully aware that this could be their best and possibly last chance to apprehend Mark before he disappeared for good. As they approached the cabin, nestled deep in the woods, the atmosphere grew thick with anticipation. The detectives parked a distance away and approached on foot, guns drawn, every sense heightened. They reached the cabin, its wooden exterior dark and weathered. The windows were closed, and there was no sign of life from within. But as they got closer, Miller noticed a faint light flickering through the drawn curtains. Someone was inside. Signaling to Harper, she moved to the door. They had no idea what they would find on the other side, but they were ready for anything. With a deep breath, Miller knocked on the door, her voice firm as she called out, "Mark Jones, this is the police. We need to talk." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then slowly the door creaked open, and standing in the doorway, looking disheveled and haunted, was Mark Jones. Mark Jones stood in the doorway, his eyes bloodshot, his face gaunt, and his clothes disheveled as if he hadn't slept in days. The detectives could see the toll the past few days had taken on him, but they couldn't afford to show any sympathy. They were here for answers, and Mark was the key to unraveling the truth. "Mark, we need to talk," Detective Miller repeated, her voice steady but firm. "We know about Laura, and we know about your affair with Emily. It's time to come clean." Mark's eyes darted nervously between Miller and Harper. For a moment, it seemed like he might bolt, but the reality of the situation seemed to sink in. With a heavy sigh, he stepped back, allowing the detectives inside the cabin. The inside of the cabin was as bleak as Mark's appearance, barely furnished, with empty bottles scattered around, and the smell of stale air hanging heavy. Mark slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. The detectives remained standing, their eyes never leaving him. "Where have you been, Mark?" Harper asked, his tone sharp. "We've been looking for you. Your wife has been murdered, and you're nowhere to be found. That doesn't look good." Mark looked up, his expression one of utter despair. I know how it looks. But I didn't kill Laura," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I swear I didn't do it." "Then where were you the night she was killed?" Miller pressed. "We've got you on camera leaving Emily's apartment late at night, driving towards Maplewood. You need to start explaining, Mark." Mark's shoulders slumped further, as if the weight of the world was crushing him. I was with Emily that night. Yes, we had a fight. I wanted to end things with her. I realized it was a mistake, and I wanted to go back to Laura, to try and fix things." "Go on," Harper urged, sensing that Mark was about to reveal something crucial. "After I left Emily's place, I drove around for hours, trying to clear my head," Mark continued. "I didn't want to go home. I knew Laura was upset with me, and I couldn't face her, not after everything. But I didn't go back to Maplewood that night. I ended up driving to a motel outside of town. I stayed there until morning." The detectives exchanged a glance. Mark's story didn't match up with the evidence they had, and they knew they had to push him further. "Mark, we have surveillance footage of your car heading back to Maplewood around the time of Laura's murder," Miller said, her voice firm. "You need to explain that, and why you were spotted near Emily's apartment again the next morning." Mark's eyes widened in shock. No, that's impossible. I wasn't there. I don't know how that's possible." "Were you alone at the motel?" Harper asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Mark hesitated, then shook his head. "Yes, I was alone. I didn't talk to anyone, didn't call anyone. I just needed time to think." The detectives could see that Mark was crumbling under the pressure, but there was something in his story that didn't add up. If he was telling the truth, someone else must have been involved, someone who had access to his car and knew his movements. But who? "Mark, did Emily know where you were that night?" Miller asked. Mark shook his head again, more vigorously this time. "No, I didn't tell her. She wouldn't have known." "Then who else could have known?" Harper pressed. "Who else had access to your car?" Mark's face went pale as realization dawned on him. I don't know," he stammered. But Emily, she has a spare key. I gave it to her a few weeks ago." The room fell silent as the implications of Mark's admission sank in. If Emily had a spare key, she could have easily used his car to return to Maplewood and commit the murder while Mark was elsewhere. But why would she go to such lengths? Was it out of jealousy, or was there something even darker at play? Miller and Harper knew they had to act fast. If Emily was involved, they needed to bring her in for questioning before she had a chance to cover her tracks. But first, they needed to confirm Mark's alibi. If they could prove he was at the motel, it would be a major breakthrough in the case. "We're going to need you to come with us, Mark," Miller said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We need to verify your story, and we're going to need you to help us figure out what really happened." Mark nodded numbly, too defeated to resist. The detectives led him out of the cabin and into the squad car, their minds racing with the possibilities. The case was far from over, but they were getting closer to the truth. They just had to keep pushing, keep digging, until they uncovered every dark secret that had led to Laura's tragic death. Back at the station, Detectives Miller and Harper worked quickly to verify Mark's alibi. They contacted the motel where Mark claimed to have stayed on the night of the murder. After a tense wait, the motel manager confirmed that Mark had indeed checked in late that night and had not left until the following morning. However, this new development didn't absolve Mark of all suspicion. If he hadn't committed the murder, someone else close to him had, and Emily was now at the top of their list of suspects. The detectives also knew they had to tread carefully. If Emily was involved, she was likely on high alert, and any misstep could give her the opportunity to destroy evidence or flee. With Mark's alibi in hand, the detectives turned their focus back to Emily. They needed to understand her motivations, her relationship with Mark, and any potential connections she had that might suggest a deeper involvement in the crime. Miller ordered a full background check on Emily. The background check revealed several intriguing details. Emily had been living beyond her means for the past few months, making several large purchases despite her modest income. Further investigation showed that many of these purchases had been made using Mark's money. But there was more. Emily had a history of volatile relationships, including a restraining order filed against her by a former boyfriend several years prior. The details of the case were unsettling. Emily had become obsessed with the man, harassing him and even threatening his new girlfriend. This history of jealousy and obsession painted a darker picture of Emily's character. As the detectives continued to piece together the evidence, they also discovered that Emily had made several phone calls to a burner phone in the days leading up to the murder. The number was untraceable, but the timing of the calls, combined with the surveillance footage of Mark's car near Emily's apartment, suggested that Emily might not have been working alone. Was there another accomplice involved? And if so, what role had they played in the murder? Miller and Harper knew they were closing in on the truth, but they needed more concrete evidence to bring Emily in for questioning. The forensic analysis of the knife found at the crime scene was still pending, and they hoped it would provide the final piece of the puzzle. In the meantime, they decided to bring Emily in for a second interview. Detectives Miller and Harper prepared carefully for their second interview with Emily. This time, they were armed with the knowledge of her financial dealings, her volatile history, and the evidence that increasingly pointed to her involvement in Laura's murder. They knew they had to tread carefully. Emily was likely aware that the net was closing in. Emily arrived at the station under the guise of a routine follow-up, but the tension in the air was palpable. She was more guarded than before, her nervous energy replaced with a cold, calculating demeanor. As she sat down across from the detectives, her eyes darted around the room, as if looking for an escape. "Thank you for coming in again, Emily," Detective Miller began. "We just have a few more questions to clarify some things." Emily nodded stiffly. "Of course," she said, but her voice lacked the warmth it had during their first meeting. "We've been reviewing your financial records, and we noticed some large deposits into your account from Mark Jones," Harper said. "Can you explain what those were for?" Emily hesitated. "Mark was helping me out. We're friends, and he knew I was struggling financially. It was nothing more than that." "But you weren't just friends, were you?" Miller pressed. "You were involved in a romantic relationship, and Mark was funneling money to you, money that his wife, Laura, might have found out about." Emily's eyes flickered with something: anger, fear, guilt. But she quickly masked it. "Look, I didn't ask him to do that. He offered. Mark and we had history, but it wasn't like we were planning anything." "Were you aware that Mark was considering ending things with you?" Harper asked. Emily stiffened. "He said some things in the heat of the moment, but I didn't take it seriously. He loved me, and I loved him. Laura was just in the way." Miller leaned in, her voice lowering. "Emily, we have reason to believe that you were near Maplewood on the night Laura was killed. Can you account for your whereabouts?" Emily's composure began to crack. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. I was at home," she stammered. "I didn't go anywhere that night." "That's not what the evidence shows," Harper countered. "We have surveillance footage of Mark's car near your apartment and later near Maplewood. You had a key to his car, didn't you?" Emily's face drained of color. "What are you saying, that I drove his car? I didn't kill Laura." "Then why were you in Maplewood?" Miller asked. "Were you meeting someone? Were you involved in planning this?" Emily's silence was deafening. She stared down at her hands, her breathing quickening. The detectives knew they had her cornered, but they needed her to break, to confess to something that would tie her to the murder. "You were seen, Emily," Harper added. And we're close to proving it. This is your chance to come clean before things get worse for you." Emily's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with a mix of defiance and fear. "I didn't kill her," she shouted. "I was there, okay? I was there, but I didn't kill her. I just wanted to talk to her, to make her understand that Mark and I, that we were meant to be together." Miller seized on this admission. "You wanted to talk to her? What happened when you got there?" Emily's shoulders slumped. She was angry. She told me to stay away from Mark, that he didn't love me, that I was ruining everything. We argued and I left. That's all. "Did Mark know you were going to see her?" Harper asked, his voice softer now. Emily shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, he didn't. I was trying to fix things on my own. I never wanted this to happen. I didn't know she would end up dead." The detectives exchanged a look. Emily's confession placed her at the scene, but it still didn't explain everything. They needed to find out who had actually committed the murder, and whether Emily had been involved in more than just a heated confrontation. "You may not have killed her," Miller said carefully, "but you were there, and that makes you part of this. Who else knew you were going to see Laura that night?" Emily's tears flowed freely now. "I didn't tell anyone. I swear, yeah, but there was someone else. Someone who knew about Mark and me." "Who?" Harper asked urgently. "Who knew?" Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. "George. George Martin. He knew everything. He said he could help, that he could make things right." The mention of George Martin sent shockwaves through the investigation. Detectives Miller and Harper knew of Martin's reputation, a man with a dark past, known for getting what he wanted through any means necessary. If he was involved, the stakes had just been raised significantly. The detectives wasted no time in diving into George Martin's background. They knew he had a long criminal record, but they needed to find the connection between him, Emily, and Mark. As they dug deeper, they uncovered a tangled web of interactions that painted a clearer picture of how Martin fit into the story. Martin had been involved in various schemes over the years, many of which involved manipulating vulnerable individuals for his own gain. It seemed that he had somehow inserted himself into the drama between Mark, Laura, and Emily, but the exact nature of his involvement was still unclear. The detectives reviewed the phone records and discovered that Martin had been in contact with Emily numerous times in the weeks leading up to Laura's murder. The conversations were brief, but the frequency suggested a relationship that went beyond mere acquaintances. Miller and Harper knew they needed to act quickly. They obtained a warrant to bring Martin in for questioning, but they were aware that a man like Martin wouldn't go down without a fight. They assembled a team and prepared for the possibility of resistance. The next morning, they executed the warrant at Martin's residence. The operation was swift and efficient, with the team breaching the door and securing the premises in a matter of minutes. Martin was caught off guard, his surprise evident as he was handcuffed and led out of his home. Back at the station, Martin was placed in an interrogation room, his demeanor calm and composed despite the circumstances. He was a man who had been in and out of situations like this before, and he knew how to play the game. Detective Harper began the questioning. "George, we've got you linked to some pretty serious stuff here. We know you were in contact with Emily, and we know about your history. Why don't you make this easier on yourself and tell us what you know?" Martin leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "I don't know what you're talking about, Detective. Emily's just a friend. I was giving her some advice, that's all." "Advice on what? How to get rid of Laura Jones?" Harper shot back. Martin's smirk widened. "You've got nothing on me. You're fishing, and you know it." Miller stepped in, her voice cold and precise. "We know you were involved, Martin. We've got your phone records, and we know you were in contact with Emily the night Laura was killed. You're not going to walk away from this." Martin's eyes flickered with something, but he maintained his composure. "I had nothing to do with that. Emily was in over her head, sure, but she acted on her own. I didn't tell her to do anything." "But you knew what she was planning," Miller pressed. "You knew, and you did nothing to stop it. That makes you complicit." Martin leaned forward, his expression darkening. "You don't know what you're talking about. I didn't tell her to kill Laura. She was desperate, okay? She wanted Mark to herself, and she thought getting rid of Laura was the only way." "So you're saying she acted alone?" Harper asked, skeptical. Martin hesitated. I'm saying I didn't kill Laura, and neither did Emily. The room fell silent as the detectives processed this new information. If neither Emily nor Martin had killed Laura, then who had? Was there someone else involved? Or was Martin lying to protect himself? Miller decided to take a different approach. If you didn't kill her, then who did? Who else was involved? Martin's gaze turned cold, his smirk disappearing. You're barking up the wrong tree. Laura's death, it was a mistake. A stupid, avoidable mistake. What do you mean? Harper demanded. But Martin just shook his head, his lips sealing shut. You'll figure it out. You're smart detectives. But I'm not saying another word. After the tense interview with George Martin, Detectives Miller and Harper returned to their desks. Martin's refusal to talk left them with a tangled mess of leads. They had a confession from Emily, placing her at the scene. But no one had yet taken responsibility for Laura's death. The idea that it had been a mistake, as Martin hinted, only deepened the mystery. The detectives decided to re-examine everything they had, starting with the forensic evidence. The results from the lab had just come in, and they were hoping it would provide the breakthrough they needed. The analysis of the knife revealed 2 sets of fingerprints, Laura's and Mark's. However, there was a third, partial print. Too faint to be definitive, but enough to suggest someone else had handled the knife. The blood spatter analysis indicated Laura's death was the result of a violent struggle, but there were anomalies in the pattern, suggesting a third party had intervened. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Miller and Harper decided to revisit the scene of the crime. The Jones home, still under police tape, was eerily silent as they walked through it again. As they moved through the house, Harper noticed a small smear of blood on the doorframe of the bedroom, nearly invisible. It was out of place, too far from the main crime scene. They quickly called in a forensic team to analyze the sample, hoping it might lead them to the elusive third party. Meanwhile, Miller reviewed the timeline of events. The discrepancy between Mark's alibi and the surveillance footage still bothered her. She suspected he was hiding something crucial. She decided to confront him again. Mark, now more haggard and desperate, was brought back in for questioning. Mark, we've been through this before, Miller began. You need to tell us the truth. What happened that night? Mark's eyes flickered with fear. I've told you everything I know. I wasn't there. I didn't kill her. But you were there, Mark, Miller pressed. Your fingerprints are on the knife, and we have evidence that someone else was involved. Who was in the house with you? Mark's face paled. I don't know what you mean. Who was in the house with you, Mark? Miller asked. We know about George Martin. Was he there? Did he help you? Mark shook his head, tears welling up. No, it wasn't like that. George didn't do anything. He just said he'd help me fix things. Fix things? How? Mark hesitated, then broke down. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just wanted to talk to Laura, to make things right, but when I got home, she was already dead. Miller's heart pounded. What do you mean already dead? Who was there, Mark? Mark's sobs intensified. I don't know. I came home and there was blood everywhere. Laura was lying there, and I panicked. I called George because I didn't know what to do. He told me to leave to get out before anyone saw me. So you left and George cleaned up? Harper asked. Mark nodded, his face twisted in anguish. I didn't kill her, but I didn't stop it either. I just ran away. The room fell silent as Mark's confession hung in the air. It wasn't the full story, but it was enough to place him at the scene and implicate George Martin in covering up the crime. But the biggest question remained. If neither Mark nor Emily had killed Laura, then who had? With Mark's partial confession, the case was nearing its conclusion, but there were still loose ends. The detectives had enough evidence to charge Mark as an accessory to the crime, and Emily was also implicated. But the actual murderer remained elusive. The forensic analysis of the blood smear on the doorframe came back with a startling result. It was a match for George Martin. This placed him at the scene of the crime, but it still didn't confirm him as the killer. Miller and Harper decided to press Martin one last time. Armed with the new evidence, they confronted him in the interrogation room. You lied to us, George, Miller said. We have your DNA at the scene. You were there when Laura was killed. It's over. Martin's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. He knew he was cornered. "I didn't kill her," he said, his voice flat. "I just cleaned up the mess." "Then who did?" Harper demanded. Martin hesitated, then finally spoke. "It was an accident. A stupid, pointless accident. Laura found out about Mark and Emily. She confronted Emily that night. They fought, and things got out of hand. Emily pushed her. She fell, hit her head. It was over in seconds." The room fell silent as the detectives processed this revelation. It was a tragic end to a complex case. Laura's death had been the result of a fight, not a premeditated murder. But the cover-up that followed, orchestrated by Martin, had turned it into a criminal conspiracy. With Martin's confession, the detectives had everything they needed to close the case. Emily would be charged with manslaughter, and Martin with obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Mark, though not directly responsible for Laura's death, would face charges as an accessory after the fact. As the investigation wrapped up, Miller and Harper couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sadness. Laura's death had been a tragic mistake, born out of jealousy, fear, and desperation. It was a stark reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control when emotions ran high. The town of Maplewood would never be the same. The case had left a scar on the community, and the memory of Laura Jones would linger for years to come. For Miller and Harper, it was another case solved, but not without its costs. They had uncovered the truth, but it had come at a heavy price.